They said this doesn't work. They stamped the research not for publication. They dissolved the committee of government scientists who were getting too close. They let the inventor's name disappear from every agricultural journal it had ever appeared in quietly, without a retraction, without a debate, without a single published reason why. No press conference, no formal announcement, just an absence where a name used to be. And here's the part that should bother you. Before any of that happened, 150,000 farmers across Europe had already bought the device. Their fields were producing double. Potatoes were coming out of the ground 6 times heavier than expected, and the entire system cost nothing to run. No chemicals, no wiring, no inputs of any kind. Just 2 pieces of scrap metal and rain. The simplest technology imaginable. The kind any farmer anywhere in the world could replicate, without a distributor, without a chemical company standing between them and their harvest. Someone made a decision. The research went into a vault. The inventor became a footnote, and the method got a label pseudoscience that nobody ever had to defend in public, because the files that could have started that conversation were already sealed before anyone outside the committee knew what they contained. I've gone through the patent, the government records, the timeline of who was making money the year the committee was shut down, and what I found is not a story about bad science. It's a story about good science that was inconvenient for a specific industry at a specific moment, when the money was flowing in exactly one direction and the last thing anyone needed was a free alternative sitting in the public domain. Here's the paper trail. To understand why this was buried, you need to understand what was at stake when it disappeared. Go back to 1918. Europe is still pulling itself out of World War I. Food security isn't a political talking point. It's a daily emergency across multiple nations. In that context, Britain quietly assembles a scientific panel unlike anything that had existed in agriculture before. They call it the British Electrocultural Committee. The roster isn't enthusiasts or fringe researchers. We're talking physicists, biologists, electrical engineers, and fellows of the Royal Society. Credentialed government scientists reporting directly to the Ministry of Agriculture, with institutional authority to draw conclusions that would inform national policy. Their mandate is specific. Find out whether electricity applied to soil changes how food grows. Not whether it's theoretically possible. Whether it actually works in real fields, with real crops, under real conditions. For nearly 2 decades, they run trials, fields and greenhouses, controlled plots. Instead of chemicals applied on top of the soil, they bury copper and zinc plates inside it. The interim reports that survived describe results the committee clearly wasn't prepared for. Wheat sprouting faster than control plots with no chemical intervention. Root crops developing at rates that couldn't be attributed to weather, seed genetics, or seasonal variation. One report, still partially accessible in the archive, uses the phrase substantial gains and explicitly requests expanded funding for continued trials. These were not scientists hedging against uncertain data. These were scientists asking for more resources because the data was pointing somewhere they wanted to follow. Then, 1936 arrives. The committee is dissolved without a press release, without a published summary of findings, without any public statement about what nearly 20 years of field data had shown. 2 complete volumes of trial records, yield tables, and internal correspondence receive a stamp in red ink. Not for publication. The documents are sent to government archives. In 1936, the exact same year, not a decade later, not a generation later, but the same calendar year, the Haber-Bosch process broke through commercially across Europe. This is the industrial method for converting atmospheric nitrogen into synthetic fertilizer. Chemical plants started signing government contracts at scale. The ammonia-based fertilizer industry didn't exist in any meaningful commercial form a decade earlier. By the late 1930s, it was one of the fastest-growing industrial sectors on the continent. Enormous capital, government partnerships, a market being built around one foundational idea, that farmers needed to purchase what went into their soil every single growing season. A technique that produced comparable results for free. Two pieces of metal and rain had no place in that economic model, not because it didn't work. Because if it worked, the market being constructed around synthetic fertilizer had a serious problem before it had even finished being built. Here's the logic I keep coming back to. If the committee's results were negative, you publish them. You use 2 decades of government-funded research to definitively close the door on the theory, point to the data, and move on. That's what negative results are for. You don't stamp them not for publication and lock them in a vault. You only seal results when those results create a problem for something outside the science. When the data, if it became public, would complicate a conversation that someone with influence needed to stay simple. And the British Committee wasn't even the first case. There was an earlier chapter, with a cleaner paper trail and a more complete record of what was erased. A decade before the committee was dissolved, a Franco-Swiss inventor named Justin Christoph had already built, field-tested, and commercialized the same core principle at scale. His background wasn't that of a backyard experimenter. Patents registered across France, Switzerland, and Belgium. A gold medal from the French National Society of Agriculture. By the 1920s, he was lecturing at universities and presenting at expositions across Europe. In 1927, Christoph filed Swiss patent CH118648A. He called the device the electromagnetic terrestrial apparatus, a zinc basin shaped like a shallow bowl mounted on a wooden pole with a flat copper plate positioned above it. No external wiring, no power source. Just 2 metals, zinc as the anode, copper as the cathode, positioned to interact with the soil below and the atmospheric electrical field above. He published the yield numbers directly inside the patent document, not in a journal that could be retracted, inside the legal filing itself, on permanent public record. Oat fields producing 200% more grain than control plots, potatoes yielding 30 to 35 tubers per plant, where farmers expected 5 or 6, beans tripling their output through drought conditions. Christoph didn't publish these numbers and disappear. He ran public demonstrations. Agricultural journals across France and Belgium covered the trials. Factories ran at full capacity. By the late 1930s, more than 150,000 units were installed across Europe. Germany and Italy were in active negotiations to license the technology outright. Then the name is gone. No landmark study disproving the mechanism. No public refutation. No controversy. Because controversy requires someone to show up and argue in the open. And no one did. The devices end up in barns and sheds. The patent tables become footnotes nobody cites. The technology doesn't get defeated. It gets removed from the conversation by being starved of institutional attention until the generation that knew it had worked was gone. 2 independent lines of inquiry. One inventor with 150,000 customers and a gold medal. One government committee with nearly 20 years of field data, both pointing in the same direction, both silenced inside the same decade, both leaving behind sealed files and no clean explanation. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns are exactly what we pull apart on this channel. Before I show you how to test this, I want to explain the mechanism, because this is where the pseudoscience label falls apart completely. Not against fringe theory, against textbook chemistry and documented plant biology. When zinc and copper are placed in contact with wet soil, they form a natural battery. Not a metaphor, a functioning electrochemical cell. The 2 metals sit at different positions on the electrochemical series. Zinc has a significantly higher tendency to lose electrons than copper. When a conductive medium bridges the gap, in this case, mineral-rich moisture in soil, electrons flow continuously from the zinc toward the copper. The result is a direct current of approximately 1.1 volts. This is identical in principle to the earth battery Alexander Bain built in 1841. It's the same chemistry inside every AA cell in your kitchen. Nothing speculative about the energy source. The question that actually matters is what that current does once it's moving through the root zone. Roots detect and respond to electric fields. a phenomenon called electrotropism documented in peer-reviewed literature. When a low-level current runs through soil, roots actively grow toward the cathode. In practical terms, the root system doesn't expand randomly. It orients. It navigates toward the current source, positioning itself in contact with water and minerals it would otherwise never reach. As the zinc electrode corrodes in damp soil, and it will corrode, because that corrosion is the reaction working, it releases zinc ions directly into the active root zone. Plants require zinc to synthesize tryptophan. Tryptophan is the entry point of the auxin production pathway. Auxins govern nearly everything about how a plant grows: stem elongation, fruit development, root architecture, stress response. Without sufficient zinc, the auxin pathway runs below capacity. With a slow-release zinc source positioned at the feeder roots, it runs at full capacity continuously. Two mechanisms, both grounded in established biology and standard electrochemistry, neither requiring any assumptions beyond what's already in the literature. And here's what makes the suppression story harder to dismiss. In 2018, a research team in China published field results from exactly this setup: copper and zinc plates in moist agricultural soil. They measured yield increases of 20 to 30%, alongside denser root systems and measurably stronger drought resistance. One peer-reviewed study, published nearly a century after Christoph filed his patent, pointing in the same direction. The mechanism was never broken. It was never disproven. It was just never allowed to develop into a body of research large enough to be impossible to ignore. You can test the core of this right now: 2 coins and a piece of sandpaper. Every U.S. penny minted before 1982 is 95% copper. Every penny minted after 1982 has a core that is 97.5% zinc wrapped in a thin copper shell. Same face, same size, completely different composition. One is your cathode. One is your anode. The galvanic cell is already built. It just needs moisture to activate. Lightly sand both coins to strip surface oxidation and expose clean metal. Dig 2 small holes on either side of your plant's root zone, roughly 4 inches apart, 4 to 6 inches out from the stem where the active feeder roots are densest. Place the copper penny on one side, the zinc penny on the other. Cover both with soil and water normally. Moisture closes the circuit. The cell activates underground and stays active as long as the soil remains damp. Nothing to connect, nothing to adjust. The system runs continuously, day and night. A basic multimeter with probes touching the 2 buried coins gives you a direct voltage reading. Above 0.5 volts, the system is active. Below 0.5 volts, the zinc is consumed and needs replacing. Keep a written log, installation date, voltage readings every 2 to 3 weeks, visible changes in growth rate, leaf color, fruit set. Run it against a control plant in identical conditions with no coins. That comparison is the only thing that separates an observation from actual data. One limit that matters: 1 zinc coin per plant. Excess zinc ions cross from growth stimulating to phytotoxic. If you see leaf yellowing or root stalling, the soil is oversaturated. Remove 1 coin and retest before drawing conclusions. The value of running this isn't just in what grows. It's in what gets documented. There is a specific gap in the research record on this mechanism, a gap that starts exactly when the money showed up on the other side of the argument. Every controlled result from a grower who ran a real comparison and logged the outcome is a data point that, according to the institutional consensus, shouldn't exist. Here's where I have to be direct, because this is the part that matters for Roost Conspiracy's credibility and yours. The mechanism is real. Electrotropism is documented science. Zinc's role in auxin synthesis is textbook plant biology. Galvanic current from a copper-zinc pair in wet soil is basic chemistry with nearly 2 centuries of experimental record behind it. None of that is in dispute. The conflict is in the magnitude. Christoph's patent claimed 200% increases in oat production. The British Committee's sealed reports hinted at gains substantial enough to suggest national policy implications. Neither set of numbers has been reproduced in a modern, independently controlled, pre-registered study with transparent methodology and peer review. The 2018 Chinese study returned 20 to 30% gains, real and meaningful. But it is one study, one soil type, one climate, and 20 to 30% is not 200%. The variables are significant. Soil pH changes how quickly zinc corrodes and how bioavailable the ions become. Mineral composition affects conductivity. Temperature shifts the reaction rate. Different plant species have different zinc sensitivity thresholds. What unlocks the auxin pathway in one crop can tip into toxicity in another at the same concentration. So the evidence supports this. The mechanism exists. Low-level galvanic current influences root orientation. Zinc bioavailability affects plant hormone production. And small-scale testing is scientifically sound and worth running. The evidence does not support this. That burying 2 pennies will triple your harvest, not with the research volume that currently exists. And here is the problem the Roost conspiracy audience should sit with. Synthetic fertilizer prices have increased over 200% in 5 years. Food security is an explicit geopolitical priority on multiple continents. There is every rational reason to be funding serious, multi-site, multi-crop, multi-season trials of low-input electrochemical soil stimulation right now. The cost would be trivial compared to any major agricultural research budget. Nobody is funding it. Not one major research institution in Europe or North America has a published, ongoing, pre-registered trial on galvanic electroculture. Not one government department has commissioned a systematic review of the historical data, including the sealed British files sitting in an archive right now, undigitized, unanalyzed, accessible in principle, and untouched in practice. The question isn't whether the science is worth investigating. It clearly is. The question is why, in a moment when cheap chemical-free alternatives to synthetic fertilizer should be the most fundable research on the planet, this particular line of inquiry stays exactly where it was in 1936. Unfunded, unlabeled, waiting. Here's where the trail goes cold, and the location matters. The British Electrocultural Committee's files exist. They are sitting in archives right now. But the complete volumes, the full yield tables, 2 decades of field correspondence, the internal reports that preceded the not-for-publication decision have not been digitized. No independent research team has reviewed them comprehensively in decades. No journalist has published a full account of what they contain. We know the stamp exists. We know the committee was dissolved. We know the timing lines up exactly with the commercial rise of synthetic fertilizer. What we don't know is what the final data actually showed. That's not a loose end. That's the entire question. Christoph's patent is on record. The yield numbers are printed inside a legal document that cannot be quietly retracted. But the independent verification that would have turned those numbers into scientific consensus never happened. 150,000 units were sold. Results were reported by farmers across the continent. And then the conversation stopped, not because someone published a refutation, but because no one with funding and institutional standing ever chose to continue it. I don't know if Christoph's 200% numbers were real. I don't know what's in the sealed volumes. I don't know whether the research gap is the result of active suppression or just the ordinary way that inconvenient science gets starved of oxygen until it stops moving. What I do know is this: the label pseudoscience was never earned. It was applied. And the difference between those two things, between a conclusion reached through evidence and one imposed through institutional authority, is the entire reason this channel exists. If this video did what it was supposed to do, you're not walking away with a clean answer. You're walking away with a better question. That's what Roost Conspiracy is built for. Every single week, we take a method that got a label, pseudoscience, debunked, don't bother, and we go back to the actual source material, the patents, the archived trial data, the financial timeline. The moment the money showed up and the science went quiet, and we ask the one question that almost nobody in this space is willing to ask out loud: who decided this doesn't work, and what were they protecting when they made that call? If you want that question in your feed every week, subscribe right now. Hit the bell and share this video with one person who grows food, because I guarantee no one is telling them this story. The archive is deep. We've barely opened the first drawer.